Good evening, everyone, and welcome to CMA Way by C-Courses webinar. It's 6 p.m. I see we already have 40 participants online. We're expecting quite a few more, but in the interest of time and for those people who've been diligently waiting, I would like to start the program this evening. I will just start with some brief introductory remarks and then hand it over to our expert speaker, Dr. Mitchell Shulman. My name is Dr. Saul Stern. I'm a family doctor in Oakville, Ontario. I'm co-medical director of C-Courses, and we are delighted to invite you to this webinar. As you've heard and seen, the way we're going to run this webinar this evening is Dr. Shulman is going to present his slides, and then after his slides, which will take approximately 35 minutes, we will open it to questions. I will be presenting the questions to him, and I will be monitoring the chat line. The way to ask a question is to send a message on the chat line to the organizers only, and we will make every effort to answer your question. We've already received a list of questions, and it is my role this evening to assimilate those questions and present them to Dr. Shulman. If we don't specifically are unable to answer your question, I apologize. We will do our very best. This is our first webinar that we've held, and we do apologize if there's any technical glitches. But as I said before, we're quite excited about this program. This program is being recorded, so that if you have to leave or you have a colleague who wants to hear some of the information, we will send you a link afterwards to get the recording done. So again, we hope you enjoy the evening. Please send your questions to organizers only. And after Dr. Shulman does his presentation on COVID-19, we will endeavor to get as many of your questions answered as I present those questions to Dr. Shulman. I'll come on after Dr. Shulman's talk, and I will ask Dr. Shulman to briefly introduce himself and start the presentation this evening. Thank you very much.
So it's sort of moved where it is.
Good evening, good morning, howdy to everyone out there in Etherland. I'm Dr. Mitch Shulman, and as it's 6:05, I guess we'll get started. I've started off with a bit of a cartoon. I want you to understand from the start that this is not because I take this topic lightly, but I do want to present it in a way that I hope you'll find engaging and fun and joyful and pleasant. And so we'll try and keep the presentation humorous, lighthearted, and on course, but please don't mistake that for a failure to understand the gravity of this illness. As you'll soon understand when you know my background, you'll know that I have been working with this disease since the very start here in Canada. And I've been the one in the emergency room decked out in my spacesuit, telling an 80-year-old who can barely breathe and is probably dying in front of me, have you decided on your level of care? Or do you have any loved ones you'd like to speak to by phone because they won't be allowed to be here, but you're going to die in the next little while? So I take this disease very, very, very seriously. And that'll probably be the most serious point in the entire conversation. But I just wanted to set it up properly that way. So as Saul has indicated, some basic rules. You'll all be muted. It's not a personal statement, and it has nothing to do with your personalities. But what it will do is enable us to keep this going well. And if you send in your questions, we really will make an effort to get back to them at the very end. Why should you listen to me? I'm a great guy and I know all those other things, but why listen to me? Well, there are a number of, I think, very legitimate reasons why you should listen to me. Let's just go back. We'll try and go back. Love technology. Well, basically, the reason why you should listen to me has to do with the fact that not only have I been living this for a fairly long period of time, that is me, by the way, in 2014 in my infamous Ebola suit. This is me now working in the emergency room, gowned up before I see patients. So I work in an emergency room. I'm Royal College certified and MFRCP specialist in emergency medicine since 1983. I know it's terrifying. I'm one of the first cohorts. I actually wrote one of the first exams, if not the first exam, and sat as an examiner for the Royal College. I was acting director of my emergency department, was its research director for over a decade, and then spent 16 years in pharma, where at the end I was actually fairly high up and had a deep understanding of how pharma works within Canada. On top of that, I am constantly involved in this topic. As you can see from that upper picture over here, and I don't think it's very flattering, but we'll let it go. I'm on the radio at least 2 or 3 times a day, answering questions and dealing specifically with COVID. Since this started in March, I have been on regularly, both in Toronto and here in Montreal, as well as St. Catharines, Ontario, Ottawa, and elsewhere along the Bell Media network. And in fact, as today is an example, I've already been on the air 4 times. I do TV. I appear weekly, and that's WEE, not WEA. I think it's WEE. I appear on Global TV on a regular basis, once a week, and I do occasional interviews for CTV, our local affiliate as well. In fact, I was on just this past weekend discussing the quote-unquote second wave. I also write. I have a weekly column in the Suburban, the largest English language weekly in Quebec, touching only on COVID topics every week now. It's not where it started off, but that's what we've been doing now. But at least you think it's all work and no play for Dr. Mitch. I'm also a level 3 ref. And as part of my responsibilities to my local community, I'm actually sitting on a committee looking at the reinstitution of minor league hockey within our community and the rules and regulations that they will follow. Having said that, you have to understand something, and let's see if we can get this to work. Hold on for just a second.
The opinions expressed in this segment are those of the commentators. As the information surrounding COVID-19 is constantly evolving, you should check with your own healthcare provider regarding your specific.
So I'm not sure if you could hear that. If you couldn't, don't worry about it. But basically, it's a disclaimer that appears every time I appear on air. And that disclaimer has to do with the fact that the information is constantly changing. So we're going to go over a lot of things right now. I hope you'll find them interesting. I hope you'll find them relevant. I hope there'll be a stimulus to conversation. Let me end the intro which I hope has given people enough time to get settled, with a practical comment that I make every time I lecture at C courses, and I consider it a tremendous honor and a privilege to be able to work with you on behalf of C courses, and I'll explain why. Aside from the joy of teaching, there is the fact that, as I've said at many of my previous courses for C courses, your collective wisdom is much greater than any one of us individually. And part of the beauty of having a meeting like this is your insights, your experiences, the things that you're aware of, the things that you've done, the things that you've seen. And so I'm very much looking forward to the feedback and to the chat at the end, your questions, and if you have comments and other things you want to share, send them to Saul and the organizers and they will get them to me. I'm very curious to hear your feedback. So with a lot of further ado, let's get going. So the objectives will be to understand how this disease is transmitted, some of the risk factors, some of the other issues. I'm going to talk about staying safe. I'll talk a lot about trying to stay safe. I'll talk about protecting others, and I'll talk about what we can expect over the next few months. But for those of you who are really busy, can I give you a quick summary? Darn tootin'. COVID-19 is the name given to an illness caused by a brand new coronavirus. New to people, not new to bats, that's usually spread by coughing and sneezing. Most infected people have very few symptoms, as you all well know, but it can run the gamut, from a mild upper respiratory tract sniffle to fulminant lung and multi-organ failure. Most people do recover, but we'll talk about long haulers and the difficulty and the possibility of reinfection. Herd immunity is not going to work. Alert, warning, spoiler. I know that countries like Sweden and all that have aimed for, whether they meant to or not, herd immunity. The largest proportion of patients found by, and we're really at the start of all this, antibody testing has been less than 10%. For herd immunity to work, you need a minimum of 80 to 90% of the population either sick and recovered or vaccinated and immune. So herd immunity is not a viable option here. So I would tell you to pray for a vaccine sooner rather than later, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Yes, anyway, they say that, anyway, yes, the cartoon speaks for itself. So what's the current situation? And this is as of September the 2nd. The numbers are a little bit worse. Worldwide, a lot of people, 25 million people sick. Almost 900,000. In fact, I think we may have passed the 900,000 mark or be very close to it in terms of worldwide deaths. Top 5 countries, the United States. India has now surpassed Brazil. So it's the United States, Brazil, India, Russia, and Peru that make up the top 5. Canada, I'm happy to say, is the 24th. This is one of those times where I'm proud to say we're not in the top 5 or top 10. The top 3 provinces in Canada, as you can see, are marked there: Quebec, Ontario, and Alberta. Montreal, my own city, has been an epicenter for this disease in Canada. A terrifying, terrifying incidence of disease. When the disease started off, it was mainly related to travel. Now I can honestly say most of the cases are not travel related because of the clampdowns that we've seen in almost every country as a result of travel bans and all that. Just to put this into perspective, we normally lose approximately 3,500 to 5,000 Canadians every year to seasonal influenza. The numbers speak for themselves. I have nothing more to say. To put this in comparison to the Spanish influenza of 1918, the H1N1 of avian origin, that infected about 500 million people, a third of the world's population, and over 50,000 Canadians died. So thankfully, we're not there, and I hope we stay far away from that. But certainly, it's a terrifying disease with a significant mortality. We'll talk more about mortality in a few seconds. But for seasonal influenza, the flu, mortality is usually below 0.1%. This has a crude mortality, and again, we'll talk more about it, of somewhere in the ballpark of 3 to 4%. There's a hidden, sorrowful story hidden within those numbers and statistics, and that has to do with elder care. The experience in Canada, and specifically in Quebec, has been that a significant number, perhaps as many as 80% of the people dying have been our elderly population. And in fact, we had in Quebec of that 5,762 deaths, approximately, it's now higher, unfortunately, 4,600 approximately were in our elderly. We've made a lot of mistakes as we've dealt with this disease. Hopefully we've learned from these mistakes. It's just a terrifying toll. So what is COVID-19? It's an illness caused by a coronavirus. It became a public health emergency of international concern the 30th of January and a pandemic the 11th of March. But this is actually fascinating. They've looked at the spread of the illness, and it was probably around earlier in China. The so-called Wuhan outbreak at that seafood market, at the Hunan seafood market, was probably a super spreader event. In other words, the virus had been around, sort of percolating through the community, and then it had a sudden super spreader, huge outpouring within the population. Other things that are interesting, so we became aware of it actually the end of December. Those of us who follow this sort of stuff had an inkling that something was going on. In January, mid-January, the Chinese had already characterized the virus. And we soon after that had a test for the virus. That's incredible when you think about the speed with which that happened. That's just to put this in perspective. An illness I commonly compare this to is polio. For those of us who are old enough to have some inkling of what polio was like, in the 50s and 60s, every spring and summer, there was a tremendous outbreak. They didn't have any idea what it was. It took them decades to figure out it was a virus, to figure out it was spread fecally orally, and then another decade or two before we had a vaccine, and the first vaccine killed many people because of a problem with it, and then it was contaminated with a simian virus because of how it was grown. We've come eons beyond that to figure out the disease and its cause, to characterize it within weeks, if not months, to have a test. And that's why I maintain a certain degree of optimism, cautious optimism, but optimism about where we're going with this disease. Each infection, that's the R0, the supposed number of this SARS-CoV-2 virus, the COVID-19 disease, causes approximately, you see the number, 1.4 to 3.9 new ones. To put this in perspective, seasonal flu is anywhere from less than 1 to 2.1. MERS is approximately 1. SARS, the original coronavirus, number 1, back in 2002 and 2004, you see the number, and compare it to measles. I think that helps to put it in perspective. We all know how infectious measles is, right? For those of you who are in primary care, if you have someone who you think you has measles, you schedule them at the end of your clinic day so that the risk of the virus hanging around in the air and getting other people sick is minimized. This is a perfect example of that. So measles, 12 to 18 for every one person infected. Measles loves to spread. So we know that the source of the virus is a positive single-stranded RNA virus derived from bats, may have passed through the pangolin to get to us, and it's transmitted mainly through droplets. Now, you're going to say, I know better than you, Dr. Mitch, and you probably do. But the major way, if you look at the way it's been spreading, the predominant way has been fairly large droplets. And that's why that classic, this goes back to the 18th and 19th century, the spread of aerosols and of droplets and things that we speak or say. So it's mainly spread by droplets. Most of the big particles that carry it drop off within the famous 6 feet, but that's not written in stone. And yes, aerosol can be formed. We know that the virus exists in our stools. And when I talk about how it actually gets into your body in a second, you'll understand that. And we know that aerosols can be generated in other ways. So for example, if someone goes to the bathroom and has a diarrheal bowel movement, flushes and fails to close the toilet seat, an aerosol plume is generated. If then that person in that bathroom uses the hot air, the forced air dryer, that can actually spread the virus throughout that entire bathroom for a period of time. And yes, the virus can land on plastic, formica, whatever you want. But again, it doesn't seem to be a major way of spread, a potential way of spread. But at the end of the day, as long as we're talking about the precautions, you can stop the aerosol and fomite spread and probably the droplet spread as well. If it's droplet spread, it also explains why we've seen some super spreader events. So one of the classic super spreader activities have been people working in meatpacking, and that's cold. The virus loves the cool air. People are huddled together. They have to scream to be heard over the machinery. So you have large numbers of people working closely together, screaming to be heard. Understood why the virus would spread there. And you saw that at some of our meatpacking plants. Similarly, one of the most major events in terms of spread, even causing deaths, as well as in the meatpacking plants, was in a choir. A church choir got together, people sang, and most of the people who attended that choir ended up getting sick, and a significant number died. Why? Well, loud noise will spread more droplets. Singing will too. And that's why the restrictions on choirs and things like that, and why you saw that huge outbreak recently at karaoke in Quebec City. Again, completely understandable if you understand what happens. There was a fascinating study looking at the risk of certain languages. And it turns out English is a particularly bad language to spread a droplet containing the virus. Why? Because we sound our P's, our T's, and our K's at the start of many words. And as many of you may realize, that's exactly how those consonants at the start of a word are a great way of spitting or spewing aerosol particles. That's really kind of disgusting, isn't it? We'll get away from that. Let's talk about something else. So it gets into the air, or you rub your nose or your eyes, and it loves, those spikes on the surface love the ACE2 receptor. And there's a huge concentration of them up in your nose. So it goes into your nose, and from there into your body, or you swallow it, it actually survives the acid in your tummy. And there are lots of these receptors in the intestine, which explains why you can get nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, especially in children, but even in adults, as a major manifestation of this illness. Once you understand the virus, you can understand why we're seeing what we're seeing. Then the virus either directly or indirectly gets circulated to our lungs. In the lungs, there aren't a lot of receptors. But the ones that are there are ones that actually are involved, as you all know, in the renin-angiotensin system, and also in the metabolism of bradykinin. And the so-called cytokine hyperimmune reaction that some people form may actually be a bradykinin reaction. As a result of the manipulations of our angiotensin-converting enzyme and its different cogeners, what ends up happening is you get a buildup of bradykinin. And bradykinin, as you may well know, actually causes a lot of the symptoms, which we'll discuss in a few minutes, that characterize COVID-19. Well, this is interesting because maybe we can use bradykinin bonding medications, of which there are 6 or 7, to modify the most severe forms of this disease. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes when we talk about some of the manifestations of the disease. So an RNA virus, it comes to us from bats. There are actually 7 coronaviruses. 4 circulate typically in us during winter, or in North America, at least during our cold and flu season, and they commonly cause the colds and the sniffles, no problems. There have been 3 zoonotic coronaviruses that have wreaked havoc on us because we've never seen them before. We think that at least 2 came either directly or indirectly from bats. MERS had a time in camels before it came to us. So you have the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, MERS, with a fatality rate of 34%, but a very slow rate of spread. You had SARS-1, which hit us in 2002 and disappeared in 2004. Luckily, we learned a lot from SARS-1, especially here in Canada. The public health system that you see in Canada right now owes a lot of its strengths to that disease. And so, whereas it wasn't a great experience, especially if you're in Toronto, we learned a lot from dealing with that disease. And now we have our latest SARS-2 virus, the cause of COVID-19. Now, can asymptomatic people spread the virus? You know the answer to this. The answer is yes. And in fact, what happens is, remember how I mentioned how the virus gets in through your schnoz usually and then goes throughout your body? You get maximum numbers of the virus in your nose approximately 4 days after infection. We know that for at least 2 or 3 days before that, people probably are infectious. And then you are peakly infectious when you are getting peakly sick. And then we think that infection tapers down afterwards. Now, why that's important is, as you well know, and we'll talk about reinfection in a few moments, people have tested positive for virus 10, 15, 20, 30 days after supposedly recovering, and they do not seem to be able to transmit the virus. Now, this is medicine. You're all going to come up with at least one case that completely contradicts me, and I get that. But by and large, statistically speaking, huge numbers of people, once you get over the disease, even if you have virus that we can find by PCR in your schnoz, it's not probably infectious. I mentioned here to protect your pets. It turns out that you, nasty people that we are, can transmit the disease to our pets, and mainly cats. You may have heard of the tigers in the zoo who got the illness. There is only one report in the literature so far of an animal transmitting the illness to a people. And these are a number of workers who are working on an infected mink farm in the Netherlands. So if you have minks, you may want to keep them away from you for now, or maybe have them wear masks. The virus, interestingly enough, doesn't appear to be transmitted from animals to people. Even if like a pet is petted and you cough and sneeze on it and it goes to another person, it just doesn't seem to happen. And it is impossible for this virus to infect pigs, ducks, or chickens. So you may want to consider adding them to your pet list. I don't know. In terms of testing, and this gets into what we were talking about a few moments ago, the gold test for now is the PCR. They shove a swab high up into your nose. They leave it there for 10 seconds. They pack it in a really expensive, fragile medium. They hope it makes it to the lab in time. And then they multiply it a gazillion times. And that's the problem with this test. The swabs themselves were in short supply. The reagents were in short supply. It's an expensive test that requires a fairly sophisticated laboratory to do it. There are a significant number of false negatives, and we'll talk about that in just a second. And in terms of its reliability, it's taking a piece of genetic material and then multiplying it. It's not telling you if that genetic material can kill you or not, or get you sick. And that's part of the problem with people testing and then testing positive and continuing to test positive, even though they have no symptoms. Is that really infectious virus, or is that just a piece of genetic material? One of the things they've been looking at is maybe we should put a cap on how many cycles we're allowing it to go through before we call it a positive. Currently, you can go for as many as 30, 40, or 50 cycles, which is extremely sensitive, incredibly sensitive. And there's talk about limiting it to 30 cycles or less, somewhere around there, to make it a more meaningful positive. But are people always positive? Well, this is medicine. I mean, let's be blunt, right? Is anything ever in medicine? So it turns out that you are very likely to have a falsely negative swab if I get you at the wrong time. So if you're incubating, if you're not very sick, if you haven't peaked, I may get a false negative. And there are other reasons for false negative, bad technique, all sorts of other reasons. Even in the best of hands, it's probably only about 70% accurate. So what we tell people is if you're positive, you're positive. If you're negative and you have symptoms, assume you're really positive and repeat the test. And 2 negatives back to back within a couple of days of each other is considered a valuable test. In terms of other screening tests, taking a temperature is public relations, in all honesty. Yes, they do it to make it seem as if they're doing something, and you can do it. There's no harm in doing it. But you all know, screening someone in an infrared with their temperature, a lot of people may not have temperatures, be asymptomatic and still be spreading. People may have taken acetaminophen or something and reduced their fever. When are they in their course? The whole bit about temperature taking, sure, you can do it, but you don't have to. Similarly with the questions are actually fairly accurate. People have to be honest. Enough said. Certainly, for those of you who follow the NBA, go Raptors, the saliva test is actually the direct result of the NBA. They funded Yale Public Health to come up with a saliva test, and this is really cool. This is a real simple test. It takes spit from your mouth, so no things shoving up your nose. It uses reagents that are readily available and cheap. It doesn't require any special handling, and get this, it can be done for under $10. Now, this is $10 US. I don't know, is it 1,000 Canadian now? But certainly it's a lot easier, a lot less expensive. The problem is it does have to be transported to a lab that's able to do that. Yale has made their test available open source, so anyone can use it who's capable of doing, and I do know that Ontario and Quebec are both looking at clearing the test for regular use. That hasn't happened as far as I know yet. They are also looking at home kits. Health Canada initially refused to even consider home testing. I'll put this in the best positive light. I'll say they were worried about how people would interpret it, and we'll leave it at that. But I think that we can trust most patients to realize that a positive is a positive, and a negative may not be a real negative. And if they have a positive, they have to be tested properly. And if they have a negative and they have symptoms, you stay at home and redo it or speak to your doctor. So that's why eventually it now looks like Health Canada will allow home kits, and there are a number that are being tested. And by a home kit, I'm talking about something like a pregnancy test. You spit on it and it'll give you an indicator, a positive or a negative or a line, something like that. Very easy to use, very reliable, and we have the technology. So you can see how far we've advanced in terms of our ability to do all of this. It's just incredible. The symptoms, you should know about all of this, right? The most common are the fever, but even that isn't in everyone. The upper respiratory symptoms, the cough. Tiredness has really been a biggie for a lot of adults. Overwhelming fatigue and tiredness. And then the other things, the muscle aches and pains, the sore throat, especially in children, diarrhea and rash and abdominal pain has been a biggie. Conjunctivitis. If you present with not feeling well and having a pink eye, you're put into COVID precautions in my hospital until proven otherwise. So as long as there's a discharge, that is. Loss of smell or taste. This was just mind-boggling. Up to 30% of patients, and again, you have to be careful about this data. Patients that we've tested that we know, right? So you have to be very careful. You have to take all of this data with a small grain of salt. But certainly a significant number of people have lost their sense of smell, and this can persist for quite a long period of time. This is extremely discomforting to a lot of people. By the way, they're thinking of using this for a screening. Universities in the States have, I think it's Pittsburgh, has actually distributed to their incoming students a smell test, one of those scratch and smell, so that you can smell and, well, not you smell, but you can see if you smell it. That's a different issue, and that has to do with showering and personal hygiene, which college, and anyway, we won't go there. But certainly, and the two biggies, and you can do this yourselves, peanut butter and coffee. So if someone has lost the ability to smell peanut butter or lost the ability to smell coffee, this is considered real and legitimate. And it's an all or none. This is not, I think I smell my coffee a little bit less well. No. This is an all or none. You lose it or you don't. And so don't worry about gradations. It's very simple. The skin rash, again, very common in kids, and the COVID toes that you've heard about, I've actually seen it. It's incredible. No symptoms. They come in and they have this thing of their toes, their discolored toes, and it goes away. In most cases, it's gone away without sequelae. And the thinking is that this is a vasculitis. We know that the virus gets into the bloodstream and triggers a vasculitis. And also this disease has hypercoagulability. So I'll be honest with you, if someone comes in with symptoms and signs and symptoms of an MI, we rule out COVID. If someone comes in with signs of symptoms of an acute stroke, we rule out COVID, because early on especially, I was seeing people with quote unquote a heart attack who actually had, well, also had COVID probably as the trigger. And we know that up to 30% of people may actually have myocardial involvement. It may even be higher. This is based on MRI studies. Again, it makes sense because we know that heart muscle has a fair number of the receptors for the virus. So we know that's a definite possibility. And the hypercoagulability state and the vasculitis definitely can lead to strokes. So we've seen that as well. And I personally took care of one of our orderlies who came in with signs, a 44-year-old orderly who came in with your classic signs and symptoms of a stroke and ended up being COVID positive. So yeah, you have to keep it in mind when you see other things. Certainly the most worrisome symptoms are the shortness of breath, the chest pain or pressure for the reasons that I spoke about, and the loss of speech or movement. And as I said, people tend to get sickest or tend to get sick about 5 to 6 days or 5 to 8 days into incubation. They tend to get the sickest around day 10 and then slowly get better. We talk about people getting better within 14 days. Yeah, by and large. I found a lot of people are just really wasted. And if you've ever had anyone with severe influenza, this should not surprise you, right? They get really, 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 really sick. They feel like they've been run over by a truck. They slowly get better, and then they're weak without any oomph for at least 2-3 weeks afterwards, but they're not sick. And I think that's not unexpected with this virus. It really doesn't expect, I'm really not surprised by that. But it does inform us so that if, for example, if someone comes in with a bit of a sniffle or a cough or something like that, and you do the swab and they come back positive, we warn them, keep a lid on your symptoms, check on it, check your temperature and all that. And if you find you're getting worse in the next 4 or 5 days, don't hesitate to reach out, because we know that's when they're going to get sickest. And that's just been par for the course here. Other things we've learned is we were tubing these patients, intubating them, putting them on a ventilator far too soon. We learned an awful lot. Our management of this disease has evolved dramatically. I was seeing people with oxygen saturations in the 80s, completely, well, relatively asymptomatic, talking to me, not cyanosed, not looking sick. They met the criteria for intubation. They were put in a medically induced, coma. We gave them propofol, put them to sleep, paralyzed them, and intubated them. And then we did the whole bit with prone intubation and supine, the whole bit. In retrospect, I don't think it was, well, my ICU colleagues tell us it's no longer needed. And so we're actually watching them. And if they're not deteriorating, if they're not having increasing difficulty breathing, if their only thing is a bit of shortness of breath and an O2 sat, usually in the 90s, the high 80s, we'll watch them, obviously in a monitored setting, obviously in the ICU, and see where they go. But we're certainly a lot less aggressive in terms of intubation and a lot of the things we were doing. Again, medicine has evolved and has learned an awful lot. And that's why the labs are really important. Some of these lab results are fairly straightforward and obvious, like the low lymphocytes, the low eosinophils, the elevated neutrophils. And what happens is they can have a relatively normal, well, it's usually elevated white count, but the ratio changes completely. And I've seen this. In fact, there was a patient I just saw the other day who came in, 44-year-old guy, literally with chest pain. And no, I don't like 44-year-old guys. Just happens. Both the stroke and this were both 44. Maybe one was 44 1/4 and the other one was 44 2/3. But he came in with chest pain, documented COVID a few days before Sunday. So about 4 or 5 days before, and his white count was exactly classic. The liver enzymes do get elevated, and one of the markers we've been using to see whether that cytokine storm or that bradykinin storm, whatever you want to call it now, where their own immune system and their body's reaction is taken over and dexamethasone and steroids may be useful, has been the level of C-reactive protein. There's a sudden spike in the C-reactive protein that goes from high, and we're talking about really high, in the 400s, to super high. LDH can also be elevated, as can the dimer, and the dimer and the very low lymphocyte count can actually be associated with increased risk of mortality. So that may help us to predict who's going to get sick, because that's one of the real problems with this. It's really tough to know who's going to crash and who isn't. And so and I've seen it, they go very quickly. Someone comes in with increased effort of breathing, O2 sat, we'll say 92, 91. You supplement their oxygen. We put them on Optiflow. We put them on CPAP. We didn't initially, by the way, CPAP was a no-no because of the risk of aerosol generation. How we manage these patients, by the way, in terms of aerosol generation is a whole lecture in and of itself. And then we put them on 100% oxygen with additional nasal prongs, all sorts of things to do it. But when they go really fast, which brings us to our prognosis. The numbers tell us that most people will recover. You're going to say, okay, but, and your but is very appropriate. Long haulers. What's the story with these people who 2, 3, 4, 6 months, a long time afterwards, seem to have ongoing symptoms, chest pain, shortness of breath, fuzzy thinking, really can't get back to their normal lives because of all these horrendous symptoms. I must tell you, I don't know what to make of this, and there's a logical reason for this. A lot of the people who are quote unquote long haulers who have been supporting each other online, many of them have a classic story. They were very sick, they didn't test, they got better, but they never got 100% better or got worse again. And the question is, were they really positive for COVID? Because by the time a lot of them come to testing, there's nothing there. And many of them don't even have antibodies. So I know it is real, and I'll tell you why I know it is real. Beautiful data coming out of Italy and the UK showing people who had recovered. I'll give you a perfect case story. A 40-odd-year-old, so I don't want to get lost in the 44 again, but a 40-odd-year-old Italian professional diver, one of those guys who goes underwater to fix pipes and do things like that, comes down with COVID early on in March, gets really sick, but recovers, but can't go back to work. Chest pain, shortness of breath, lightheadedness, can't function. He had obviously been tested in March. He had documented disease. Well, Italy and the UK, amongst other countries, have created rehab facilities for these people. He went to rehab and is almost back to normal. So that proves that there is something. I'm not sure what its relationship is to COVID, but rehabilitation of lungs and muscles does work, and facilities set up for that do make a difference. What about reinfection? Look, it's a virus. People shouldn't get measles again. They do. People shouldn't get mono again. They do, even with the same virus. It happens. But think about it. There are at least 25 million people worldwide that we know have COVID-19 or have had it. Countless millions more we've never tested. How many reinfection cases are there? So yes, I believe it can happen. No, I don't think it's going to be a widespread issue. No, I don't think it's an indication that we're quote unquote not creating viable immunity and our vaccine is doomed. And you have to look at the cases that have been reported. One of them was a guy in Hong Kong who tested positive, went traveling, came back from Spain, was screened, had absolutely no symptoms, and tested positive. He had no symptoms, he didn't spread it to anyone else, and his first bout at the start in Hong Kong had been very mild. The other 3 cases from the European Union, all again, same type of story. Test positive, get better, screened, found to be positive, no symptoms. The one fly in this ointment, and it's medicine, there's always a fly in the ointment, is a case out of, I think, Las Vegas, a younger guy who had a fairly significant case of the disease and tested positive, recovered, got very sick again, and tested and was positive again with a different strain, proving that reinfection may happen. Now, why am I reassured? I told you I'm cautiously optimistic about all of this. What am I worried about with reinfection? Well, one, I'm worried about people getting sick and not effective protection. But what am I really worried about? You may know about dengue. Dengue is a disease transmitted by a mosquito, and what basically happens is you get sick and you feel miserable. But if you get sick a second time, like you recover and you're exposed again to the same bug through the mosquito, you get really, really, really sick. They call it breakbone fever for a reason. So dengue is one of those infections, and there are a couple of them where the first one seems to set you up for a much worse reaction the second time. Well, thankfully, this doesn't yet seem to be the case for this disease. And so a vaccine, if and when we get one, is unlikely, and again, cautious optimism, to set you up for being much sicker if you actually get the disease and because you're exposed to it in the wild. So that's why I'm cautiously optimistic. Mortality numbers are all over the place, and it's all a function of how you measure it. Right? How many people are really infected? How many of these cases are really confirmed? You need to know both the numerator and the denominator to be able to figure out the real numbers. And so right now we're quoting a mortality rate of about 3 to 4%. Some of the best data we have is from the Diamond Princess. You may remember that cruise ship. What a horror story. If you want, there's a great review article about what happened in the Atlantic a couple of months back, looking at the whole case of what happened. So they ended up having approximately 13 deaths out of the 712 documented cases, giving them a crude mortality of about 1.8% factoring age and all that, 0.5%, but that's still 5 times the expected seasonal flu mortality. So this is significant. It's not the 34% of MERS, and it's not the much lower numbers by and large that we saw with SARS-1, but it's significant. And typically, we do know that there seem to be comorbidities. Age, without question. Even the healthy elderly, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. Gender, we'll look at that in a second. Guys have it by and large worse. In Canada, that wasn't the original case, but our numbers seem to be reflecting that reality more and more lately. Certainly comorbidities. In many of the studies, one of the most important comorbidities hasn't been hypertension, although it's important, hasn't been diabetes, although it's important, obesity. Obesity is a real problem. These people, and we can go into all the reasons, there are lots of plausible reasons. Obesity is a real risk factor. BMIs of 30 and 40 really do increase people's morbidity and mortality. And then ethnicity, there does seem to be an increased risk of contracting the disease and dying from it in different ethnic groups, Latino and Black American, Afro-Canadians. We're not sure. Does this only reflect access to care, or does this reflect other issues? People aren't 100% sure about this. The same thing about why males more than females. There are a million hypotheses. One of the best ones has to do probably with estrogen and your immune system. And the part of the controlling of the female immune system is found on the X chromosome. They have 2, guys only have 1. And so there may actually be a mechanistic reason why you're seeing increased male mortality from this disease. There could be other things going on. But basically, if you look at the actual numbers and you look at ICU admissions and death, and these are Canada data as of the 4th of August. I don't think they're going to change. If you look, it's basically males until you reach to the 80 plus, where there are just more women around than there are guys, just blunt. But if you look at it, it's mainly males, and those are the ones that are getting the strongest distribution of the disease, in other words, ending up in the ICU, and that hasn't changed. And in terms of deceased, it's even more prominent, right? Older people die of this disease, and male older people die of this disease, and that's a risk factor, and it's just the way it is. Another way of looking at it, you can see mortality. But there's no group that's completely safe. Up until recently, there was only 1 documented death under the age of 20, a young woman in Alberta with very little information being shared. There was a 10-year-old who had died in the Toronto area, but it ended up, after the coroner reviewed the case, he died, or the child died, with COVID-19, not because of COVID-19. Well, this death of this 19-year-old CJEP student, a junior college student, he was completely healthy. There was no reason for him to die. So whereas death and disability in children is a lot less, no one is immune. And that's part of the message that we have to take seriously. We need to protect everyone from this virus, but we can do that. I'm sure we can do things properly. So other things to consider, there has been a dramatic increase in domestic and gender-based violence, depending on the community, by and large, anywhere from 20 to 30% increased, which makes perfect sense. The stresses, being forced to stay at home, all sorts of things going on, not being able to have access to resources because you're forced to live with your abuser, all sorts of reasons, something that we have to be aware of for sure. The anxiety, whether you call it COVID-induced nightmares or doom surfing, that where they just stay on for hours and hours and hours looking at all the horrific stories that are out on the internet, or you want to call it chronophobia, it's real. The number one thing that many GPs are reporting in our community is anxiety. And I see it all the time in the emerge, whether a direct cause or an indirect cause of that visit. Anxiety is right up there contributing to it. We've also seen, there's a lovely article in the New York Times where this dentist in New York City reported an increased incidence of dental fractures and temporomandibular joint problems. She related it to a number of things. One, well, people haven't been seeing their dentists, and that's just practical, although dental offices are now open again almost everywhere, I would think, with a lot of precautions put in place. Two, we really haven't been taking very good care of ourselves and of our teeth. I won't talk about COVID-19 weight, and we'll just leave it at that. And plus, a lot of people are grinding their teeth, whether they're aware of it or not. By the way, and I do not claim to be, apologies to any of the dental surgeons and my friends listening, you should never feel your teeth touching when you're just there. If you feel your teeth touching, if you're not eating, you may be grinding. And so if you're finding you're having jaw pain and headaches and other things, you may want to look into that. Certainly trying to relax, taking a deep breath. One of the things to consider is your laptop positioning. If many of you are working from home and using your laptops, you may want to invest in a separate keyboard and mouse so that you can put your laptop up on something so that it's at eye level, but you're actually doing things at a more comfortable height. And take a break. You know, the 20-20-20 rule. Every 20 minutes, look away for 20 seconds, at least 20 feet into the distance. And that helps to break things in, get up and move around. And those are just good hints in general, but they help with this. And then there's the whole story of all the delayed surgery. We really got this wrong. We did a lot of things very wrong with this virus. And I understand we got focused, but we panicked. And we dropped a lot of the balls that we should have been juggling. Now, some of them for very legitimate reasons. We thought we needed ICU beds. We thought we needed a lot of ventilators. So we shut down surgery so we would free up beds, free up operating rooms and their ventilators. And that made perfect sense. But as a result of that, there is a huge backlog. The CMAJ just published an article for Ontario, something like what? 84 weeks if they do 717 surgical cases to catch up? That's assuming they can do that. What about the misdiagnoses? What about the mistreatments? I won't tell you the number of people I've seen in the emergency room with infections, diabetic feet, things that have gotten a lot worse because they were afraid of coming to the hospital. And certainly in Quebec, we've noticed at least a 40% drop in cancer surgery, at least that number of people, and a significant number waiting more than the benchmark number of days. Typically, at least 57,000 Quebecers are diagnosed. That's 5,000 a month with cancer. We haven't been making those diagnoses. So how many diagnoses are we missing? How many people are out there suffering for no reason? And I mention this because as we enter into the second wave, all of you are going to have to consider how you personally can keep this from happening within your own practices. And we'll touch on that in a few seconds when we talk about what we should do. So, should I wash my hands before or after I wash my hands? I have never washed my hands more often than, and I actually clean down my screens on a regular basis in the Emerge. I was never this meticulous. It's terrifying, but it's a good example. Watch Quebec. For those of you not living in Europe or the States, for those of you in Canada, we've done all sorts of really doofus things here in Quebec. Ontario, for example, is about a month behind us in terms of opening up schools. Well, see what we're doing and watch what happens. This will give you a perfect gauge for what not to do and what works. Certainly, a lot of what's happened in Europe, in Italy, and Germany and France and the UK has been very informative for how we're going forward, what to do and what not to do. Countries like South Korea, China, Taiwan, Japan have given us a very good indication that things like hand washing, physical distancing, and wearing a mask do work. There is a fear or a thought that this is because these are more, I don't know what adjective to use, more willing to listen to authority societies. And we'll leave it like that. That's pure poppycock. That truly is a form, some people say, of racism. I'm not going to comment on that. But the truth of the matter is the countries that have responded, some of the best, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, all were exposed to SARS-1. And they learned from that. And the people, for a lot of people, that's very fresh in their memories. So when they said this is a SARS-like virus, they took it seriously. When they said stay at home, they stayed at home because they've been burned. And then they've gone through all these other things. So I'm expecting that over the next period of time, wearing a mask may become the new norm for us, even if there is a vaccine. And that would be great, because one of the things that you may not have realized is the incidence of colds and flus, or flu-like illnesses, has dropped dramatically over the winter season. Now, partly it's because I guess we weren't testing, partly because a lot of these people were just too afraid to come to the emergency room, and I get that. But partly it's because hand washing, physical distancing, and wearing a mask also protects you from that. And that's been the example in Australia. Remember, we always look to the Southern Hemisphere for our upcoming flu season, and certainly the experience there has been a very mild, knock on wood, flu season, part of which probably has to do with this, which brings me to the last point. Set an example in terms of how you conduct your office, how you conduct yourself, how you do things in terms of all these other things, and get vaccinated. My emergency room, our emergency rooms are just about stretched to the max right now. I can't afford a second wave. I certainly can't afford flu at the same time. So it's going to be very important to get vaccinated. Yes, and try and help people deal with all the anxiety and angst of the various things that are present. What do I think the next few months will be like? The numbers are going to go up, especially in the Northern Hemisphere. Schools are reopening. We're moving indoors. One of the things that halted the spread of the disease was good ventilation and the fact that we can maintain a better distance from people because we were spending most of our time outdoors. As soon as you move indoors, poor ventilation, people are closer together, even with a mask. You can expect the numbers to go up. And fatigue. People are sick and tired of doing this day in and day out. I see it in the emergency room, and I understand it. And so one of the things we have to do is keep their confidence up, keep reassuring them that it's working, and it is, and that they need to do about it. What am I worried or not worried about? I'm not going to worry about absolute numbers of new cases. I'm going to watch hospital admissions, ICU admissions, deaths, and available beds. I realize that deaths lag approximately 2 to 4 weeks behind what's happening. So I am going to look at hospital admissions and ICU admissions, and that's why I'm very reassured right now. In spite of the spike in numbers in my province, for example, Quebec, our hospitals are the same or less, and our ICU admissions are less. That's a very good sign. And as long as we can keep that happening, we'll be good. Why? COVID-19 isn't going away. I talked about the herd immunity. I talked about the fact that we're going to need a vaccine. We're going to need to get everyone vaccinated. And even then, it's going to take a while. So we've got to learn with this virus. It's there. And one of the things we're going to have to realize is you're going to have people getting sick. That's why we have to avoid the second wave, quote unquote. What is the second wave? It's not more people getting sick. More people are going to get sick. It's an overwhelming number of people hitting the healthcare system in such numbers that we can no longer cope with them. They overwhelm our resources, they overwhelm our emergency rooms, they overwhelm our hospitals, they overwhelm our ICUs, they overwhelm our number of ventilators. And that we can avoid. If we do what we're doing now, we're going to get increase, we're going to get a trickle, we will avoid the second wave. Part of that is also a function of supporting your local public health, contact tracing, and closing down on numbers is really, really, really important. What else? Well, what you're doing. For those of you who've reopened your offices safely, following the criteria, it really does make a difference. Telemedicine, catching up with your patients. What you have to realize is you know your patients much better than I do. So if they're coming to the Emerge, they're missing out on someone who knows them. So if you're available to give them advice, to talk about what's going on, you know them much better than I do. And every patient you save going to an emergency room is a huge improvement, is a huge advantage. Another reason why you don't want them going to the emergency room. We've talked about how the emergency rooms, quote unquote, are safe because we want people not to be afraid to come in with their stroke or their heart attack. Must tell you the truth though, as we're getting stressed again, our numbers now are reaching our pre-COVID numbers, which means overwhelmed emergency rooms. We're less able to separate out our patients, the ones in the waiting rooms and the ones who are COVID positive and COVID negative. So there is a risk if we inundate our emergency rooms or our clinics that you will get local spread of the disease. And you also don't want that to happen. So am I cautiously optimistic? You bet. I could quote the director of the World Health Organization, but the truth of the matter is we've done a real lot of good. And yes, there have been bumps in the pathway. Yes, there have been glitches. Yes, we have goofed up. But by and large, we're not seeing the numbers who died of Spanish influenza. We're not seeing any of those other numbers. And if we can stay the course, get our act in gear, I'm confident that by the time we get a vaccine, which will probably be, the first vaccines will probably be approved towards the end of October, November, and that has nothing to do with politics, just has to do with when the phase 3 trials are expected to give us results, which means you'll start getting distribution December, first quarter of next year. Now, why you're going to have this is, and this explains something, for those of you who've been in research, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3
Mitch, it's Saul Stern. We're losing you. While Mitch is trying to get his audio back, I'll just intervene. Just for housekeeping.
I'm back.
You're back. Okay. Thank you.
So I don't know where I cut off, but basically I was talking about cautious optimism, the fact that we should have a vaccine by the end of this year. It'll probably be out sometime in 2021. Distribution will be an issue just because you got to get all these people vaccinated. But don't think that they're cutting corners politically or otherwise. The process takes as long as it does, not because it takes that long, but because of inherent delays. And the last delay I was talking about was the delay of government approval. It can take Health Canada up to 2 years to approve something. Obviously, they're not going to take this long now. They're going to be approving the data as it comes out. And the manufacture, it can take a fairly long time to ramp up manufacture because of government support. Most of the companies are already ramped up. So once they get the goods to go, they say they can go, you're going to see vaccine available. So that's all very encouraging. Sorry for the technical glitch. Thank you so much for listening. For those of you who've been able to follow throughout the entire lecture, this has been an absolute pleasure and a joy. It's nice to be able to share information. It's nice for people to have a better sense of what's going on. And my screen won't let me go to my last slide, but my last slide should say thank you. There we go. And open it up to the chat line. Thank you again.
Mitch, thank you so much for this presentation. We have about 100 participants on the line, and from a housekeeping point of view, your invite said that this seminar would be from 6 to 7 p.m. Mitch has agreed to stay on till 7:30, so we will endeavor to answer all those questions. Obviously, if people have to leave, we wanted to thank you. We will be recording all the Q&A as well for your future reference. So Mitch, I'll get right into it. We've had a lot of questions about offices and practicality. So what happens if a staff member in our office tests positive for COVID? Does the physician's entire staff need to be off for 2 weeks? Can the staff member return to work if the test is negative and asymptomatic?
So basically you have to follow your local public health, and nothing I say will contravene public health. I can tell you by and large, it's really a function of contact and symptoms. If someone tests positive and you've all been in very close contact, and close contact is more than 15 minutes face-to-face or more than 2 hours in the same room with them, you're probably going to have to go into isolation for a period of most likely 14 days. But that'll vary according to your public health system and contact tracing and the setups of your office. This has come up in other contexts. If your kid tests positive, right? Your kid goes back to school, your kid tests positive, does that mean you have to close your office? And public health here in Quebec has said no. As long as you're healthy and not showing any symptoms, and your kid is now relatively isolated from you, you can continue with your office. That's important for us because it would dramatically affect our staffing in the hospital, for example. And so that is the current thinking for now. But again, you're going to have to touch bases with public health, and that should be what happens. Your worker tests positive, public health should be involved immediately. And they should be telling you, this is what we do, this is how we do it. One of the other things we've been saying is, if people have no symptoms and they've tested positive, as long as they have no symptoms for at least 48 hours, they can then probably come back to work without necessarily needing a negative test. Again, that's what public health here has been saying. That may differ in your community.
Great. Thank you, Mitch. There was a question about COVID antibodies. I know there's some research being done in Canada. Had a lot of patients asking us when they can get tested for their antibodies. How do you answer that?
There's no antibody testing practically available right now. It is being done, but it's not practically available. And antibodies, we're not sure what they mean. People freaked out because the antibodies were dipping after a couple of weeks or months, but that's exactly what you expect. Think about it. Your B cells manufacture the antibodies, they tag the virus, and your T cells, the different populations, come and zap them and kill them. Once you've killed the virus, you don't need those antibodies circulating. So the numbers should go down, and your memory cells should stay ready to pop up when needed. So that's what I'm saying. I'm not sure what antibody testing really tells us. Certainly there's a study looking at 33 kids who tested positive, and they had both antibody and active disease at the same time. And this persisted for a period of time. So were these kids still infectious? No one knows. So what I tell people about antibody testing is, don't worry about it for now. It's not going to make a difference right now. It probably actually will not make a difference in terms of vaccination, because I don't think it'll be widespread enough for us to test people before they get vaccinated. And so we'll just be vaccinating them. My expectation and hope will be, even if you've been exposed to the virus, and that's where this whole reinfection story becomes important, being vaccinated should not be dangerous. We have that already as an experience with other vaccines and other illnesses. And so my comment would be, I tell them, don't worry about antibody testing. One of the reasons we were afraid to test people broadly for antibodies, you may have remembered early on, there was that whole comment about the COVID passport. You would test for antibodies and therefore, quote unquote, you're immune and safe to do whatever you wanted. We don't want that happening, because we don't understand what the course of the disease really is and what will happen. So that is false. And that's another reason why you're not going to see widespread antibody testing for a while. We don't encourage silly behavior on the part of people who think they're protected.
Thank you, Mitch. I know this varies from province to province and communities, but one of the participants wanted to know what the turnaround time generally was for swabs in your area. And that physician was also concerned that many physicians might just start treating again with antibiotics symptomatically, hoping it's not COVID and praying that the patient gets better. What are your thoughts on that?
So turnaround time for us is 24 to 48 hours, but I do know it's been much longer depending upon how many people are being tested. Capacity everywhere has been ramped up, and so it should not take more than 24 to 48 hours, or 48 or 72 hours. The maximum has been 72 hours. What I do tell people, though, is you have to be careful how you're transmitting the information. Are negatives being called, for example? Not all test centers are calling their negatives. We do, but not all test centers do. I think it's important that people know a negative and know what a negative means. And if you have symptoms, you're not really negative. And what the positive means and what you need to be on the lookout for. So we're talking about anywhere from 48 to 72 hours. In some cases, I get same day. So a patient comes into the emergency room, they're very sick. If they're tested early enough in the morning, I have it by the late afternoon. In terms of your question about antibiotics, I will tell you in March and April, every patient who came in with the respiratory symptoms got Tamiflu, ceftriaxone, and originally it was azithromycin. And we gave them that cocktail until we knew that they were COVID positive. Now that was lunacy, absolute lunacy, but it reflected the science at the time and our panic. We know that oseltamivir doesn't work very well in influenza at the best of occasions. We know that you can be co-infected. You can have influenza and COVID-19. So testing positive for COVID-19 didn't mean that you had the other. And we know that there's dangers with azithromycin, for example, as an antibiotic, QT prolongation, and these patients may be at risk. So we've gone away from that. We treat them as needed. If they look like a bacterial pneumonia, and don't forget you have your white count to go by, you have your dimer, your C-reactive protein, your chest x-ray, you have a number of things to guide your therapy. For those of you working in offices, you don't often put these people on antibiotics, do you? So I would go with your usual practice for now. And if in doubt, you get a white count, you get the CRP and the dimer and or the ferritin, and you get a chest x-ray or send them to the emerge. Please call first, though.
Okay, we'll do that, Mitch. Two-part
Not
question.
if you're in Vancouver, though.
Okay. Any clinical tips, and this doesn't have to be scientific, we want to get your personal experience to help clinicians distinguish between COVID-19 from the ordinary cold and flu. And the second part, the anosmia, do you think that may have anything to do with encephalitis or cerebral involvement?
Yes to the last question. An MRI study out of France shows that a significant number of these people have involvement of their brain, whether they're truly encephalopathic or have gone all that way. The original thinking was that it was a local process involving where the virus likes to hang out in the top of your nose. But there may be more going to this, and there's certainly MRI evidence. Just as there's MRI evidence of heart involvement, there's MRI evidence of a brain involvement. Although I haven't seen anyone with true encephalopathy purely on the basis of COVID-19 yet. It's medicine. Anything could happen. In terms of clinical tips, no. I wish I had. I've been surprised by the people who turned up negative. Let's put it that way. There are a lot of people I looked at and I said, oh, this person's definitely going to be COVID positive. And they come back negative even when they're retested. And at the end of the day, to be honest with you, I just isolate. Anyone who comes in with fever, cough, those type of symptoms, whether it's the sniffles and all that, you're going to stop the spread of a cold, right? In theory, someone with a cold should have been staying home anyway. So I treat them all the same. I tell them all to stay home for a couple of days, to retest if they're really concerned or something happens, the warning signs of what to be on the lookout for, and that they have to be at least 48 hours without any fever or any other symptoms before they can return to their normal activities.
Thank you, Mitch. We've had at least 10 questions on travel, and which is not surprising.
Nope.
So the questions that, to summarize, how safe is air travel now? Is the airlines doing what they can? Are the HEP filters working? Are masks necessary? And would you yourself travel to Tanzania or Arizona before the end of the year?
Wow. I would limit my travel, but that's just me because I'm paranoid. Certainly if you had to travel, depending on where you're going and the airline, it's probably safe. If you look at what the airlines have done in terms of their environment, their filtering of the air is just incredible, and their screening has been very effective. So I would, if I had to fly, have absolute confidence in flying without question. I would definitely wear a mask. Duh. One of the interesting cases of transmission, when we were talking about transmission through a fomite, there was an evacuation from Italy of people who were from South Korea. And they were evacuated, and what they did was they screened them before they got on the flight and didn't let anybody with symptoms go on the flight. It turned out, I think something like 6 people on the flight ended up actually being an asymptomatic, missed in screening. And only 1 or 2 people on that flight actually got sick from them. And the only way one of them may have gotten sick was that she had taken off her mask to go to the bathroom. Oh, so maybe it was the fomite, maybe it wasn't good hand washing, maybe it was the aerosol in the bathroom. But certainly there doesn't seem to be a lot of airline spread, and certainly wearing a mask and good hand hygiene would seem to be reasonable. Now, you asked about going to Arizona. I'm very uncomfortable about travel to or from the states right now, with the exception of certain specific northeastern states, which by and large seem to have understood the severity of the virus and clamped down on things properly. Here in Canada, there's no travel allowed, I think up till September 21st for now. They've extended it to only essential travel. But certainly I'd be very uncomfortable traveling to certain countries right now because of what's happening in them, or allowing people from those countries in. And for now, unfortunately, the United States is one of those countries. They looked at where the virus was coming from in travelers. There's still some people forced to travel or are traveling right now. And the countries where these people, there were many less people obviously testing positive as a result of travel, and the countries were predominantly coming from the United States, Mexico, and Guatemala. Why Guatemala? I have absolutely no idea, but certainly I would be careful about countries right now that are having problems with an increased number of cases and controlling it.
Great, thank you. So now it's sort of in respect to what you just said, put in your crystal ball. We know September 21st is the border, it's going to be reinstated. What do you think that the quarantine period required in Canada for people traveling outside Canada returning will remain 14 days until the vaccine is available, or do you think it might be changed before the vaccine is available?
That's a great question. The airlines have a lot invested in reducing the amount of time of people have to go into quarantine. So at Pearson, for example, which is the international airport in Toronto, they've instituted a voluntary program. When you land, they can test you right then and there, and then they'll test you again, I believe, at 7 and 14 days. And they're going to see if they can pick up the cases or whether they need, and if that's the case, you could see a situation or a scenario where you're tested when you leave the airport or when you leave your flight, and you stay in quarantine only for a very limited amount of time, maybe 2 or 3 days, maybe 5 days. And if you're asymptomatic, they allow you out of quarantine. That is foreseeable. We'll have to wait and see what this study and others like it show us.
Thank you. One of our participants, Mitch, said perhaps with Guatemala, the reason is because of migrant workers. So that was their thoughts. Okay. What about cruising? When do you think cruising will be safe?
I'm sorry.
Mitch, when do you think cruising will be
Yeah, I have a vested interest in this. I'm slated to go on a cruise, I believe, in February. And by the way, if you've not signed up, it'll be a C-Courses cruise. I'll be teaching. If you love this lecture, you cannot believe how much better I am in person. If you didn't love this lecture, you will love me in person. But having said that, I honestly don't know right now. I'm waiting to see. I think it's too soon. I know the cruise industry has made a tremendous effort to create a safe environment for travelers. I know that they've been working on sanitation protocols and all that. The problem with the cruise ship is that you put a lot of people from a lot of different places all together, and then you have crew that's running around, and that's what happened with the Diamond Princess, right? It was the crew that basically was spreading the virus from person to person. Now, cruise ships have a lot of experience. If you remember the rotavirus and all those other diarrheal outbreaks that they had, they've gotten very good at controlling outbreaks. So I'm encouraged that we'll be able to figure this out, but we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, thank you. Mitch, what's your viewpoint on medical liability of physicians who are asked to provide notes to their patients, giving them mask exemptions?
Say that again?
Okay, so this physician is concerned about the medical liability point of view, read the request from patients asking the physician for exemptions on wearing masks. So we're asked by a patient, please give me a note saying I don't have to wear a mask because I am claustrophobic, and the physician gives them the note. Is there any liability for the physician?
That's what I thought you asked. I can't pretend to be a lawyer, and issues like this are well beyond my professional, and I'm going to limit myself to my professional area of expertise. Having said that, I can give you an example, which I think will be illustrative. In Quebec, in the 2 or 3 weeks leading up to the opening of schools, the only reason why you could not go to school was you needed a medical exemption letter from a physician. And it was very specific about the criteria, and there was no online teaching, as there are in many communities. So you either went or you were homeschooled. Very difficult decision. And so the Collège de Médecins, our licensing body that is responsible for us, published a very particular, very direct, very detailed, short primer for physicians of why they could and why they couldn't issue medical certificates. And I would refer to something like that as my backup. So again, I'm not a lawyer and I don't even pretend to be one on radio or TV, but if you have your local regulatory authority, in Quebec it's the Collège des Médecins, I would expect them to have put in place criteria by which you should follow whether you're allowed to issue that note or not. And I would fall back on that, and even more so, I would show it to the patient. I would say I am bound by my college to do this way, by my regulatory body. So I'm sorry, I love you, you're my best patient ever, but for love or money, I can't do it, I'm sorry. And I think that will help a lot of you deal with a lot of pressure. I'm sure many of you are going to get substantial pressure from understandably concerned patients. And I don't poo-poo, I don't ignore that concern. I think it's legitimate, I think it's real. I think the best thing to do is to acknowledge it and to work with it. And if your local community does not have a regulatory body or public health that's printed it out, refer to Quebec. Go to the Collège des Médecins and refer to our criteria. This has been vetted by public health here, and it's very reasonable and very responsible.
Thank you, Mitch. Mitch, another provincial travel question. Do you know of any restrictions for residents of one province traveling to another province right now regarding COVID? I know there was some issues about the Maritimes, but can you just highlight any of those positions?
You can't go to New Brunswick, PEI, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland, as far as I know. In fact, for Quebecers who are going to go through New Brunswick to go to their country houses and all that, they had to apply online for a dispensation, and there were actually cops at the border, not allowing them through if they didn't have the right paperwork. So yes, the maritime provinces have definitely put in place restrictions on flow into their provinces. I don't know what to say about that. Certainly there are no other restrictions elsewhere except within Canada. My understanding is, with the exception of those provinces, you can fly and you're not quarantined. That's my understanding right now. But if your local jurisdiction has different rules, and that may exist, please feel free to contradict me and to follow your local rules. But as things stand now, the only provinces that I know of and that have demonstrated a restriction in travel have been those provinces: New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI, and I believe Newfoundland as well.
Great, thank you. Just going to circle back a little bit in terms of COVID testing, and you may have answered this, Mitch, so I apologize, but just to clarify, because it's really something we're getting a lot of questions about, just the false positive rate of the standard PCR test, and when do you think a rapid saliva test will be available for our dental colleagues and our physicians in general? So false positive rate PCR and this rapid saliva test.
So the rapid saliva test is purely a function of the regulatory bodies. Pressure your local regulatory bodies. The provinces have been looking into it. I know Ontario and Quebec are both looking into it. It's not rocket science. And so those delays are there and nowhere else. In terms of false positives, the PCR test that we're doing, as I mentioned, multiplies so many times that if you take it to 30, 40, 50 cycles, there's just the smallest smidgen of virus, and even if it's not dangerous, they're going to find it. So what I deal with is the following. I think the most important thing goes back to your patient and their symptoms. If your patient is symptom-free, I would retest and treat their symptoms, unless they're in a very special situation with, someone who's immunocompromised at home or something like that. So if they were symptom-free and they have a positive test, I'd go with what's going on in their exposures, and I tell them, remember, you could be positive, wash your hands, wear your mask, and that should, distancing, that all should be taken care of. I'm hoping that with time, the labs will become a little bit more sophisticated and tell us how many cycles that they had to go through before giving us a positive, or just change their criteria. Now, that may already be happening in some of your communities. You may want to reach out to your labs that are doing the testing and ask them their sensitivity and the number of cycles they're running, and that'll give you a very good idea. If they're running at more than 30 cycles, amplification cycles, then a positive should be taken for a grain of salt. And what I give you is I'll give you a perfect example. Guy comes in really sick, fairly sick, upper respiratory tract infection. You test him, 48, 72 hours, he comes back positive. You tell him you're in isolation for 14 days or until you're at least 48 hours without any symptoms. 10 days go by, he's getting a lot better, no long hauler symptoms or anything like that, afebrile, minimal cough or anything, and he calls you up and he says, I need to be retested because I work in a healthcare facility. So he comes in, you retest him, test comes back positive. What do you do? Well, we haven't even been retesting those people. Because of this high sensitivity of the test and the fact that you could just be picking up virus that's still around that has nothing to do with infectivity, if they've been symptom-free, public health in Quebec has said, you've gotten over the disease, you're symptom-free, you can go back. And that's basically, but again, everyone, irrespective, it's hand washing, social distancing, and mask wearing. And so that's how we've been doing with it. Now, may that change? Yeah, it's entirely possible, but that's how we're doing things now.
Great. Mitch, we're going to leave it for two final questions. Thank you very much. You've been amazing this evening. So two last questions. Crystal ball again. When the vaccine comes out in Canada, and you illustrated your viewpoints, do you think there will be enough for everybody to get it right away, or do you think we should just vaccinate the most vulnerable people first?
That is a brilliant and fascinating question, and I have been toying with my answer to this for a while because this is obviously something top of mind for a lot of people. We're not going to have enough vaccine, right? It comes out, even though the government has sponsored the manufacturing process, just the distribution. Are you going to get it out to everyone in time? So it's going to take a while to get the vaccine out to people. So do you prioritize people at highest risk, frontline workers, yada, 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 or you just vaccinate all comers? It turns out that all the surveys that have been done right now, a significant percentage of people will not initially get vaccinated. They'll take themselves out of the queue. So it is possible that if you opened up the doors, you might not see an overwhelming deluge of people wanting to be vaccinated. Having said that, I think it would make very good sense for public health now to come out with open and transparent criteria for who they're going to be vaccinating first. My suspicion is they will say that, well, just like with flu vaccine, they'll initially, in Quebec, flu vaccine is usually targeted towards the vulnerable with all those criteria and frontline workers. And that's what Quebec has done. I know Ontario vaccinates all comers for influenza. I think the Quebec model in terms of this virus and this vaccine will be the one that most localities will institute. I'm optimistic and hopeful that we'll have enough vaccine and people that are just taking themselves out of the queue will make enough vaccine available, but we'll have to wait and see. The other question I get asked, and you didn't, it was very polite of you, Saul, was would I get vaccinated if the vaccine were available? Now, I've been following the data, and depending on the vaccine, my answer is yes. I don't really want to get sick with this disease, and I don't think I'm immune, and in spite of my youthful vitality, I am an older person, and I'm at risk. So yes, I will most likely be one of the people to be vaccinated if it's available and if I'm able to get to it.
Okay, and this question is, I don't know how to answer this, but I'll ask it anyways. How do we handle those anti-vaxxers, those people who will not get vaccinated? Do you think will ever come to Canada that'll become mandatory?
I'm taking a deep sigh. This is a toughie. We see it right now in people who refuse to maintain distancing, refuse to wear a mask, refuse to follow even the most basic things. Look, you can lead by example. You cannot force people to do things. Having said that, I was actually questioned about that today because there was another incident at a basement bar where 30+ people were gathered without wearing masks, drinking and in close proximity here in Montreal. And I basically said, listen, this is why public health exists. I'm sorry. These people now have to suffer the consequences. I'm not talking about the police going out issuing tickets because you're less than X distance apart or not wearing a mask. But situations like this that are wanton refusals to accept basic care and protection that protect all of us in society, that is the responsibility of public health. And I would like to see public health step up and take its responsibilities in this case seriously. Look, I don't know about many of you in your jurisdictions, but I have a fair amount of experience. If we have someone who's TB positive and infectious and they're refusing therapy, we're allowed to force therapy on them for the public good. I think that's something we need to consider. Now, I know I can already hear the feedback here. I get it. I really, really do. And it's a slippery slope and we have to be careful. But I think there are certain situations specifically where we have to consider the risk and the public good. And the same way that we can close down bars or stop kids from playing hockey for a period of time, I think it's reasonable to take action in this regard. Now, you'd asked about mandatory vaccination, and again, that becomes a legal quagmire. I do know that in this province, you can say to a person the criteria for doing this job is proof of vaccination against X, Y, and Z diseases. And if you do not have vaccination, you can work, but you can't do this job. And that's what public health has done. That's what's happened here. I do know that there was a period of time when measles was rearing its ugly head again, that it was a requirement for registration of your kid to school that you had proof of either disease or vaccination against measles. And again, that's a local jurisdiction legal decision more than anything else. Certainly, I think we as physicians and healthcare providers, whether you're a doctor or a dentist or an osteopath or a physiotherapist or a nurse, whatever your profession, psychiatrist or ER doc, I think we all have a responsibility to play up the positive, explain why, and then people are entitled. And if they have a logical reason why they're afraid to get vaccinated, sometimes you can answer those questions and remove that fear of vaccinations. They don't become anti-vaxxers. But I will tell you, studies looking at measles vaccination, for example, have shown that science and logical arguments do not work against people who are rabidly anti-vaccine. And the only thing that works, unfortunately, is someone in their family, someone they know, someone close to them, suffering the ill effects of not having been vaccinated, coming down with the disease. And that has been dramatic in its ability to change the opinion of anti-vaxxers. So I hope it doesn't come to that. But certainly, that's the only thing with measles, for example, that has been shown to work for the people that are violently anti-vaccine, anti-measles vaccine.
Mitch, thank you so much. I think we're going to end the webinar as is. There's still 72 participants on the line. We really appreciate at CMA Way you hanging in there. We hope you've enjoyed and learned. Mitch, I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed listening to you. You're very practical and you're passionate, and I look forward to more webinars, and maybe I'll have to look at that cruise with you in February. So I wanted to wish everybody
looking forward to it.
Okay, everybody a good night, and thank you. And Mitch, I'll give you the last word.
Thank you all most sincerely. I think the most important message that I can give to you is we've suffered worse. Maybe not in our generation, and maybe that's why it's hitting us so hard. But for that generation that survived polio, the generations that have survived other pandemics, we've had worse, not to minimize this, so we can pull through this. And as long as we maintain consistency of message and openness and transparency in terms of why we're doing what we're doing, people will buy in. I've seen it. Most people are just really great about this, and we can do this. We really, really can. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your patience. And I look forward to speaking to you again, hopefully in person, sometime soon.
Good night to everybody. Thank you again. Good night.